The letter was already written. I had folded it twice, pressed the crease with the flat of my thumb until the paper held the shape like a scar, and set it on the edge of the small wooden table beside my sleeping mat. It had taken me 3 attempts to find the right words, and even then, I wasn't sure they were right. But they were honest. And in a place like Ashenveil Keep, honesty was the rarest thing a servant could offer. To His Majesty's head steward, Lord Caden of the Eastern Hall, I, Willa of Marin's Crossing, hereby relinquish my position as chamber attendant to the King's private quarters, effective at the next full moon's passage. I hadn't signed it yet. The candle beside it had burned low, wax pooling around the iron holder in thick, quiet rivers. Outside my narrow window, nothing more than a slit in the stone wall. Really. The sky had shifted from deep violet to the bruised gray that comes just before dawn. The kind of gray that feels like a held breath, like the world itself isn't ready for what's coming. I pulled my wool cloak tighter and told myself it was the cold. It wasn't the cold. Ashenveil Keep rose from the northern ridge like something the earth had pushed up in anger. All dark stone and sharp towers, wrapped in perpetual mist that never fully lifted even on the clearest days. The Lycan kingdom of Valdris was not a place built for softness. Everything here was deliberate, heavy, built to endure. The corridors smelled of pine resin, tallow, and old iron. The floors were worn smooth by centuries of boots. Even the tapestries on the grand hall walls seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, their deep crimson and black threads telling stories of wars I hadn't been alive to see. I had come here 2 years ago from a small village at the edge of the Marin forest, brought by a recruiting party of the Crown, one of 12 young women selected from the outlying settlements to serve in the keep. My mother had cried. My younger brother had looked at me like I was already someone else. And I had told them both that I was going to be fine, because I was practical, because I was careful, because I knew how to make myself small enough to survive in large spaces. I had survived. That much was true. But surviving and living are different things, and I had learned that distinction slowly, in the quiet hours between duties, when I had too much time to think. My role as chamber attendant meant I was one of only 4 servants permitted to enter King Theron's private quarters. I lit the fires in the morning. I ensured the hearth in his study never died. I changed the linens, brought water for washing, carried out correspondence trays when asked. I did not speak unless spoken to. I did not look directly unless addressed. I moved like a shadow, because that was what the position required, and because looking directly at Theron of Valdris for too long felt like staring into something that didn't have edges. He was not cruel. That had surprised me when I first arrived. The stories they told in Marin's Crossing about the Lycan king were the kind mothers used to keep children from wandering into the forest after dark. Ruthless. Cold. A man whose wolf was closer to the surface than most alphas, who had ended a border war in a single night through means no official record fully described. A king who had ruled alone since the age of 19, who had never taken a mate, who was said to look at people the way a storm looks at a shoreline, not with hatred, but with a kind of absolute indifference. What I found instead was a man who read until the candle died, who kept a cracked clay cup on his desk that no one was permitted to remove, though I never learned why, who sometimes stood at the window of his study for so long that I would finish the fire and slip out without him ever acknowledging my presence, not from cruelty, but from a depth of thought that simply left no room for small things. I was a small thing. I had always known that. And for 2 years, I had been content to be exactly that. Quiet, reliable, invisible. It was safe. It was simple. It was the kind of life I could manage without losing anything I couldn't afford to lose. Then 3 weeks ago, Lord Caden had gathered all senior servants in the Great Hall and announced, with the particular flatness of a man delivering information rather than news, that His Majesty King Theron had accepted a formal betrothal arrangement with Lady Seraphine of House Kalen, one of the oldest noble bloodlines in the Southern Territories. The wedding, Lord Caden had said, would be planned for the season after the harvest. Lady Seraphine would arrive within the month to begin her residence at Ashenveil Keep. The hall had murmured in a low, collective sound. Not quite surprise, not quite approval. Just acknowledgement. The kind of sound a room makes when something inevitable finally happens. I had stood at the back, near the stone pillar where I always stood when gathered with the others, and I had felt nothing. I told myself I had felt nothing. The letter on my table said otherwise. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands, not reading it. I knew what it said, but feeling the weight of it. 2 years of careful distance. 2 years of being a shadow, of training myself not to notice the way his voice dropped slightly when he was tired, or the way he sometimes closed a book and just held it for a moment before setting it down, as if releasing something. 2 years of telling myself that service was not the same as closeness, that proximity was not the same as knowing someone, that a man like Theron of Valdris existed in a world so far from mine that there was no honest bridge between them. I had been very disciplined about it. And then one evening, perhaps 4 months ago, I had come to tend the fire in his study and found him already awake, sitting at his desk in the low light, reading a letter that had clearly come by urgent messenger. His jaw set, his eyes still, the particular stillness of someone absorbing something difficult. He had not asked me to stay, but he also hadn't dismissed me, the way he usually did with a slight motion of his hand. And so I had stayed near the hearth longer than necessary, feeding small pieces of wood into the flame, not looking at him, and at some point he had said, quietly, not to me, perhaps to no one at all, "Some decisions follow you no matter how far ahead you try to run." I hadn't responded. It wasn't my place, but I had thought about that sentence for weeks afterward, turning it over the way you turn a stone in your hand, feeling its weight, its edges. I had never told anyone that. I pressed the letter flat again and set it down. The candle sputtered. Outside, a guard changed at the tower. I heard the scrape of boots on stone, the low exchange of voices. Dawn was coming. My duties would begin in less than an hour. The fire in the study, the water basin, the correspondence tray. Same as every morning, except that this morning, when I walked through those doors, I would do it knowing that within the month, everything about this place would change. Lady Seraphine would bring her own attendants, her own preferences, her own way of organizing a household. The chamber routines would shift to accommodate her rank. My role would likely be reduced, reassigned, or eliminated entirely, and I should have felt relieved by that possibility. I should have wanted the easier path. I reached for the quill to sign the letter. The door to the servant corridor opened. It was Petra, the youngest of the chamber staff, barely 17, her dark hair still loose from sleep, her eyes too wide for the hour. She looked at me, then at the letter on the table, then back at me with the particular expression of someone who understands something before they have words for it. "The king is already in his study," she said. "He's been there since before the midnight bell." I set the quill down without signing. "Go back to sleep, Petra," I said. She hesitated. "Willa, he asked for you specifically, by name." The candle between us had nearly burned out. What remained of the flame bent sideways in the draft from the open door, throwing light across the folded letter, across my name, written in my own hand, on a piece of paper that suddenly felt less like a decision and more like a question I wasn't ready to answer. By name. Theron never asked for servants by name. I left the letter unsigned on the table. I told myself it was only because the hour demanded it. That a king who sent for a servant by name before dawn was not a king to be kept waiting, and that my personal decisions could survive another hour without being made official. I told myself it was professionalism, practicality, the same careful discipline I had maintained for 2 years. I straightened my apron, pulled my dark hair back with a strip of cloth, and followed the corridor toward the upper wing without letting myself think too carefully about what I was doing. The halls of Ashenveil Keep at this hour were a different world entirely. During the day, they moved with purpose. Stewards carrying ledgers, guards rotating posts, kitchen staff hauling baskets from the lower cellars, noble advisors walking in clusters of hushed conversation. But before dawn, the stone breathed differently. Torches burned low in their iron brackets, casting long amber shapes across the floor. The shadows between pillars were absolute. My footsteps were the only sound, and I kept them soft out of habit. A habit so old now that I wasn't sure I remembered how to walk any other way. The door to the king's study was slightly ajar when I arrived. A thin line of firelight escaped through the gap, falling across the corridor floor in a warm, uneven stripe. I stopped outside it, the way I always did, and waited. "Come in, Willa." His voice was unhurried, low, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to reach you. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The study was the largest room I tended, though it never felt excessive. Every surface was occupied with purpose. Maps waited at the corners with iron discs, stacked correspondence organized by seal, shelves of bound records reaching almost to the ceiling, their spines worn from use. 2 narrow windows faced east, still dark, though the first gray suggestion of morning had begun to thin the black at their edges. The hearth across from his desk was burning steadily. Someone had already tended it, which meant he had been here long enough to manage it himself. Theron stood at the window rather than the desk. He had his back to me, arms crossed loosely, looking out at the dark ridge beyond the glass. He was still in the clothes he'd worn the day before, the deep charcoal tunic, the riding leathers he hadn't changed out of since returning from the eastern boundary 2 days ago. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, the way it got when he'd been running his hands through it. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, built the way men of his bloodline were built. As though the wolf beneath the skin gave the body a kind of structural certainty that ordinary men lacked. But what I had always noticed, in the small, careful glances I allowed myself, was the tension he carried across his upper back. Not aggression, something more like weight. He carried a great deal of weight. "The fire is already lit," I said, because I needed to say something that wasn't personal. I lit it. He didn't turn. "Sit down." I paused. "My lord?" "Sit." He said it gently, not a command in the sharp sense, more like an instruction offered by someone who didn't want to argue about the formality of it. "Please." There were 2 chairs near the hearth, high-backed, used when advisors came for private counsel. I had never sat in either of them. I moved to the closer one and lowered myself to the edge of it, keeping my back straight, my hands folded in my lap. The fire was warm on my face. The room smelled of pine smoke and ink and something else. Rain, maybe, or the cold of the outer air still clinging to his clothes. He turned from the window and looked at me. I had learned, over 2 years, to meet his gaze for exactly long enough to show respect without lingering. But this time he was studying me with a kind of quiet directness that made the usual calculation difficult. So I looked at the fire instead. "Caden tells me you submitted a letter of resignation this morning," he said. My head came up before I could stop it. It hasn't been signed yet. He saw it on your table when he passed your corridor on his night rounds." A pause. He told me immediately. Of course he had. Lord Caden was nothing if not efficient. I pressed my hands flat against my knees and breathed carefully. "It is within my rights, my lord. The terms of service allow for... I know what the terms allow." He moved away from the window and came to stand closer to the hearth, not sitting, just standing near it the way he sometimes did, as though proximity to the fire was a habit from somewhere older than this room. "I'm not asking you about the terms. I'm asking you why. The question landed simply. Too simply. It didn't give me anywhere to deflect. With the Lady Seraphine's arrival, I said, choosing each word with the care of someone navigating uncertain ground, the household will require reorganization. It seemed practical to Willa. He said my name the way he'd said sit, without impatience, without edge, but with a finality that meant he wasn't going to accept the next carefully worded half-answer. I closed my mouth. The fire popped softly between us. Outside, the first pale light had begun to show at the window's edge. You are the best attendant in this wing, he said, with the same tone he might use to note that a map had an accurate border, factual, without embellishment. You are precise. You are discreet. You have never once caused a disruption in 2 years of service. Those qualities do not become obsolete because of a change in household arrangements. They may become redundant, I said, and was surprised by how steady my own voice was. Lady Seraphine will bring her own staff, her own preferences. My position may no longer. Your position is mine to determine, he said. Not Caden's, not Seraphine's, mine. The air in the room shifted slightly. I was aware of it. The way the conversation had moved from formality into something that didn't have clean edges. I looked at my hands. Then I would ask that your Majesty consider reassigning me to the lower halls, I said. The laundry rotation, or the kitchen stores. Something with less. I stopped. Less what? I didn't finish the sentence. I wasn't sure I could finish it honestly without saying something I had no right to say. He was quiet for a moment. Then he sat, not at his desk, but in the chair across from mine, the one the advisors used when they brought him difficult news. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, and looked at me with that same level, unhurried attention. I am going to ask you something, he said, and I want you to answer it honestly, not as a servant answering a king, just honestly. I met his eyes, amber, darker than most, with the particular quality of depth that marked a Lycan of his lineage, as though what you saw on the surface was only the outermost layer of something far larger beneath. I had worked very hard for 2 years to not think about his eyes. Did something happen, he asked, that made you feel unsafe here? The question surprised me so completely that for a moment I didn't know what to do with my face. It was not the question I had expected. I had prepared in the corridor on the walk over for demands or dismissal or a formal procedural argument. I had not prepared for that. No, I said. Nothing of that kind. I have always been. The keep has always been safe for me. He studied me a moment longer. Then he nodded, as though confirming something he had suspected. Then stay, he said. It was quiet, almost simple. Your letter is not yet signed. Consider it unwritten. My lord, the engagement changes the court, he said, leaning back slightly. It does not change what I require from the people I trust in my own household, and I trust very few people in my own household. The word trust sat in the air between us like something solid. I felt the pull of it, the dangerous, foolish pull of it. And I did exactly what I had trained myself to do for 2 years. I nodded. I kept my face careful. I folded my hands in my lap and said, "As you wish, my lord." But as I rose to leave and crossed toward the door, something made me pause at the threshold. Not wisdom. Something older and less obedient than wisdom. I turned back, just slightly. May I ask, why by name, when you sent Petra? You never ask for anyone by name. He had already turned back to the window, the gray morning beginning to bloom behind the glass. He was quiet for long enough that I thought he wouldn't answer. Because some habits, he said, are harder to correct than others. I left before I could think about what that meant, but I thought about it all day. Lady Seraphine of House Kalin arrived on a Thursday, when the fog sat low over the ridge and the courtyard torches burned amber in the gray mid-morning air. I watched from the upper corridor window, the narrow one that overlooked the main gate, because Lord Caden had assigned me to prepare the East Solar for her initial reception, which meant I had reason to be on that level, and reason to be near that window. And I told myself that was the only reason I was standing there watching the procession enter through the iron arch of the outer gate. She came with 12 attendants, 2 covered wagons of personal effects, a personal herald, and 4 armored escorts bearing the silver and green colors of House Kalin. The horses were beautiful, pale gray, well-bred, the kind that spoke of wealth maintained carefully across generations rather than displayed carelessly. Even from above, I could see that Lady Seraphine herself moved with the precision of someone who had been taught from childhood that every motion was observed and every motion carried meaning. She was tall, dark-haired, like most of the southern noble lines, her hair coiled and pinned beneath a traveling hood of deep green velvet. Her posture was the posture of someone who had never once doubted her right to occupy a room. And she was. I registered this with the same careful neutrality I tried to apply to everything. Genuinely striking. The kind of woman who fit naturally into the visual language of a royal court, as though she had been composed specifically for it. Theron stood at the base of the main steps to receive her. He was dressed formally, dark tunic, the gray ceremonial cloak with the Valdris crest at the shoulder, his hair pulled back. He looked exactly as a king receiving a betrothed should look. Contained, appropriate, unreadable. He took her hand when she reached him and inclined his head, and she dipped into a precise curtsy, and the courtyard watched the whole exchange with the quiet attention of people who understood that they were witnessing the beginning of something with large consequences. I turned from the window and went to finish preparing the solar. The weeks that followed were a careful rearrangement of everything I had learned to navigate. Lady Seraphine was not unkind. I registered that clearly and made myself hold on to it. She was demanding, precise about the temperature of her evening fire, particular about which candles were used in her chambers versus the public rooms, meticulous about the organization of her correspondence. But her demands were consistent, and consistent demands were manageable. She treated the servants with the particular courtesy of someone who had been taught that visible cruelty was beneath a person of rank. It was a cold courtesy, the kind that maintained distance while remaining technically civil, but it was better than several alternatives I had witnessed in this court. She brought her own head attendant, a thin, efficient woman named Maret, who had clearly been with the House Kalin household for many years, and who reorganized the East Wing's staff assignments within her first 4 days, with the brisk authority of someone who did not expect resistance. 3 of the existing chamber attendants were reassigned to lower hall duties. 1 was transferred to the kitchen rotation entirely. My assignment was not changed. Lord Caden informed me of this with the same flat delivery he used for everything. His Majesty has specified that the staff of his private quarters remain unchanged, he said, without looking up from his ledger. You are to continue as before. I said, Yes, my lord, and left. I did not think about what it meant. Or rather, I thought about it, and then put the thought somewhere I couldn't reach it easily. The difficulty was that everything became more visible once Seraphine was there. Before her arrival, Theron's study had been a place of routine, predictable, quiet, self-contained. I moved through it every morning with the ease of repetition, and the ease of repetition had a kind of mercy in it. It left little room for noticing. Now I noticed. I noticed that he worked later than before, his candles burning down past the midnight bell more nights than not. I noticed that the correspondence trays were fuller, the maps more frequently consulted, the chair at his desk pulled slightly closer to the window, as though he was spending more time looking out of it. I noticed that the small clay cup, the cracked one that had always sat on the edge of his desk, had been moved to the shelf. Not removed, just moved, as though its usual place had been made available for something else. And I noticed, without wanting to, that on the evenings when the formal suppers were held and Seraphine presided at the long table in the great hall, with the particular grace of a woman rehearsing for her permanent role. Theron sat beside her and was entirely, impeccably present, and that there was a difference between presence and warmth, and that the difference was visible if you knew what to look for. I told myself I did not know what to look for. I was becoming a poor liar. The morning it shifted was an ordinary morning, which is how these things usually happen. I came to the study at the usual hour, earlier than dawn, with the wood for the hearth and the basin of clean water. The door was partially open, as it had been the morning he'd called me in by name, and I stopped outside it the same way, out of habit, out of the instinct for boundaries that 2 years of service had made second nature. But the voice I heard through the gap was not Theron's. It was Seraphine's, simply asking that the East Solar be designated as my primary receiving room for formal visits. It is the appropriate space. I don't understand why this requires your specific approval when the household staff... Because the household staff operates under my direction. Theron's voice, even and unhurried. And I prefer to know when significant changes are made to the keep's arrangements. It is not a significant change. It is a room assignment. Everything in this keep is a significant change until I decide otherwise. A pause, not hostile, controlled. The solar is available to you for your use, Seraphine. I have no objection. I am simply noting that I was not consulted. A silence. Then her voice, slightly adjusted, still composed, but with a faint tightness beneath it. You will need to consult me as well, my lord, once we are wed. That is the nature of a shared rule. Yes, he said. It is. Another silence, different from the first. I stepped back from the door, pressing myself to the wall beside it. My heart was doing something inconvenient. I waited, staring at the corridor ceiling, listening to the quiet that followed. The particular quiet of 2 people in the same room who are both choosing not to say the next thing. Then footsteps, and the door opened wider, and Lady Seraphine stepped into the corridor. She saw me immediately. Her gaze moved from my face to the wood in my arms, to the basin in my hands, and back to my face. It was a fast assessment, practiced, thorough, the kind of look that categorized before it concluded. You are the morning attendant for this wing, she said. Yes, my lady. She studied me for a moment longer than the question required. There was nothing overtly hostile in it, but there was something measuring in it, the way you measure a distance before deciding whether to cross it. What is your name? Willa, my lady, of Marin's Crossing. She nodded once, as though filing this information somewhere useful. Then she walked past me down the corridor toward the east wing, her footsteps even and deliberate on the stone. I stood where I was for a moment. Then I turned back to the study door, knocked twice, and heard him say, "Come in." He was at his desk this time. The map in front of him was the Northern Border Survey, the one with the disputed valley markers he'd been reviewing for weeks. He had a quill in his hand, but he wasn't writing. His eyes came up when I entered. I passed Lady Seraphine in the corridor, I said, because it seemed important to name it, before he wondered whether I had heard anything. I hope I didn't interrupt. You didn't. He looked back at the map. The fire is low. It was a dismissal, gentle and clear, the kind that meant the conversation was for the map and not for me. I moved to the hearth, set down the wood, and began building up the fire with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times. Halfway through, he said without looking up, "Willa, my lord." The letter. He paused. You never retrieved it. I kept my hands on the wood. No, my lord. Why not? I thought about it for a moment, really thought about it, instead of reaching for the safe answer. Outside the window, the first true light of morning had begun to arrive, pale and cold, settling across the stone floor in a slow, steady wash. Because some habits, I said carefully, are harder to correct than others. The quill went still on the map. I finished building the fire, set the screen in place, and left before I said anything else. But as I stepped into the corridor, I heard, faintly, behind me, the sound of something that might, in another life, have been the beginning of a quiet laugh. I kept walking. I was smiling before I reached the stairs, and I made myself stop. Because smiling was not something I could afford. Not yet. Not in this place, with a letter still sitting unsigned on my table, and a king engaged to a woman who had looked at me with eyes that already knew exactly what kind of threat a person could be, without ever meaning to become one. The first snow of the season came 2 weeks later, earlier than expected, arriving overnight without announcement, the way difficult things often do. I woke to a world gone white and silent beyond my narrow window, the ridge barely visible through a soft curtain of falling flakes, the courtyard below already blanketed in a stillness that made the keep feel smaller than usual, more contained, like a place holding its breath. I dressed quickly, gathered my things, and went to begin my morning duties. The halls were quieter than usual at this hour. The cold kept people close to their sleeping quarters until necessity drove them out. Even the guards at the upper corridor posts had their cloaks pulled tighter, their expressions the particular blankness of men enduring rather than standing. I nodded to the two I passed by name: Aldrich, the taller one with a scar across his chin, and young Brennan, who had been posted to this wing only a month ago and still occasionally forgot that I was permitted to be here without an escort. "Cold morning," Aldrich said. "Cold morning," I agreed. The study door was closed when I arrived. I knocked, waited, heard nothing, and after a measured pause, let myself in. The room was empty, or nearly. The fire had gone completely dark, not simply low, but fully extinguished. The hearth cold in a way that meant it had been out for hours. The desk was clear of its usual maps and correspondence, which was unusual enough that I paused and looked at it twice. The cracked clay cup was back in its place at the desk's edge. Someone had returned it in the night. I built the fire from nothing. Patience and dry tinder and careful breath. And while I worked, I noticed that the chair by the window had been moved slightly, angled more directly toward the glass than usual, and that the window itself bore the faint smear of a handprint against the frost that had gathered on the inner pane. Someone had stood there for a long time in the dark, watching the snow come in. I did not ask about it when Theron returned an hour later, still in his riding cloak, snow still caught in the dark of his hair, his boots leaving wet tracks across the stone floor from the door to the desk. He sat down, pulled a folded document from beneath his cloak, and set it open on the desk without speaking. He had ridden out alone in the snow before dawn. I knew better than to say anything about it. I poured water into the basin on the side table, set a clean cloth beside it, and was turning to leave when he said, "The eastern villages are reporting pressure from the Kalen border." I stopped. He was not looking at me. He was looking at the document, his jaw set at the angle that meant the news inside it was not good. But he had said it, clearly and without preamble, which meant he had said it to me. "Pressure," I repeated carefully. "In what sense, my lord?" "Kalen trade routes have begun diverting goods away from the eastern settlements. Grain, largely. Some timber." He turned the document slightly, as though rereading a particular line. "It may be coincidence. Trade adjusts for many reasons." "But you don't think it's coincidence," I said. He looked up then. Not sharply, just directly, with the level attention he gave to things that deserved it. "No," he said, "I don't." I thought about what Lord Caden had told me weeks ago, in a different context, that the betrothal with House Kalen had been less a matter of affection and more a matter of political necessity, that the Kalen territories controlled 3 of the eastern mountain passes, and that Valdris had spent the better part of a decade managing the cost of that dependency. I was a chamber attendant. None of this was information I was meant to analyze or respond to. And yet I was standing in this room, and he had said it to me. And I was not entirely sure anymore where the line was between serving and being present. The villages would need to know that the crown is aware, I said. Even if nothing changes immediately, knowing someone is aware matters. He regarded me for a moment. Yes, he said. It does. He looked back at the document. I left. But the conversation stayed with me through the rest of the morning and into the afternoon. When my duties shifted to the lower halls, and I moved through the familiar rhythm of the keep's daily work, carrying fresh rushes for the corridor floors, checking the lamp oil levels in the upper stairwells, delivering a forgotten bundle of correspondence to the herald's post near the outer gate. It was at the herald's post that I encountered Merritt. Seraphine's head attendant was a woman I had developed a careful, professional respect for. She was competent, and she was consistent, and in a court where many people were neither, those qualities were worth respecting. But she had also spent the week since her arrival quietly repositioning things, not confrontationally, methodically. The way someone reorganizes a space to reflect who it actually belongs to. She was speaking to the herald's assistant when I arrived, and she paused when she saw me, and the pause itself was information. "Willa," she said, pleasantly enough. "Lord Caden was asking after you earlier." "I'll find him when I've finished this delivery," I said. "He mentioned that Lady Seraphine has requested a review of all staff assignments in the private quarters wing." Her voice remained even, informational. As part of her preparation for taking up residence, I set the correspondence bundle on the herald's desk and looked at her. "That review would go through His Majesty's office," I said, equally evenly. "Of course." A small pause. "I only mention it so you're aware. Transitions can be uncertain for staff." "Thank you for the consideration," I said. I left the herald's post and walked back toward the upper wing, with the particular internal stillness of someone who is not going to react until they are alone and can afford to. Lord Caden found me before I found him. He appeared in the second-floor corridor with his ledger tucked under his arm and the expression he wore when he was delivering something he personally found distasteful but professionally necessary. I slowed my pace and waited. "Lady Seraphine has submitted a formal request," he said, without greeting. "Reviewed and documented. She is asking that the chamber staff for the king's private quarters be expanded to include 2 of her own attendants, who would share rotation with the existing staff." "Share rotation," I said. "Alongside you, not replacing." He looked at me over the ledger. "His Majesty has not yet responded to the request. I am informing you as a courtesy, since it affects your position." "I understand," I said. "Thank you, my lord." He studied me with the faint, practiced look of a man who had spent 30 years managing households and could read the subtext of a composed face fairly accurately. "His Majesty has historically been resistant to changes in that wing," he said, which was not quite advice and not quite reassurance, but existed somewhere between the two. I nodded and went back to work. That evening, the formal supper ran late. I knew because I could hear the distant sound of the great hall from the servant corridor, the low murmur of assembled nobles, the occasional rise of a voice making a toast, the structured performance of a court gathering. These sounds usually faded by the 9th bell. Tonight they continued past it. I was in the study, making the final rounds of the evening, checking the fire, straightening the desk, ensuring the water basin was clean for morning. The room was warm and quiet, lit only by the hearth and 2 candles on the desk. Outside the windows, the snow had stopped, but the world it had left behind was very white and very still, the ridge outlined against a sky that had cleared to black and sharp stars. I was reaching to straighten the clay cup on the desk's edge. It had shifted slightly, as it sometimes did, when the study door opened and Theron came in. He stopped when he saw me. I straightened immediately, took a step back from the desk. "I was just finishing," I said. "I'll be out of your way. Stay." He closed the door behind him, moved to the desk, and sat down heavily in the way of someone at the end of a long evening. He had loosened the ceremonial cloak. It hung open, the Valdres crest slightly askew at the shoulder. He looked, more than anything, tired. Not physically. The deeper kind. I stayed near the hearth. The fire was warm at my back. He looked at the clay cup for a moment, then at me. "Caden told me about Merritt's conversation with you at the Herald's Post." "It was a professional courtesy," I said, informing me of a potential change. "It was a warning," he said without inflection. "And you know that." I didn't argue. "What will you decide about the request?" He leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling, the beams, old and dark with age, that ran the length of the room. "What would you have me decide?" The question surprised me. I looked at him, really looked, for longer than I usually allowed myself. He was watching me from beneath a slight furrow, not the furrow of irritation, but of genuine waiting. He wanted the honest answer. "I would have you decide whatever keeps the peace of this household," I said carefully. "The transition will require compromise. That is simply true. And if the compromise cost me staff I would prefer to keep." The firelight moved between us. I held his gaze for a long, precarious moment, felt the pull of everything I had spent 2 years not saying. And then I looked at the flame instead. "Then I suppose, my lord," I said quietly, "you would need to decide what you value more, preference or peace." He was silent for a long time after that. When I left the study, I felt his eyes on my back the whole way to the door. And I felt, for the first time in 2 years, that the careful distance I had maintained was no longer entirely in my own control. That was the most frightening thing that had happened to me since I arrived at Ashenveil Keep. And somehow, walking down that cold stone corridor with the snow-bright night pressing against the narrow windows, I couldn't bring myself to wish it away. The dissolution of the betrothal was not announced with ceremony. That was the first thing I noticed, the absence of ceremony. In a court where everything carried ritual weight, where even the arrangement of candles at a formal supper communicated rank and intention, the end of the engagement between King Theron of Valdres and Lady Seraphine of House Kalin arrived quietly, the way a tide goes out. One morning she was there. Several mornings later, the covered wagons were being loaded in the courtyard before the 9th bell, her attendants moving with the brisk efficiency of people who had been given a clear timeline and preferred not to linger within it. I learned of it from Petra, who had learned of it from Aldrich, who had overheard something in the corridor outside Lord Caden's office the evening before. "They say it was mutual," Petra told me, in the hushed, careful voice she used when she wasn't sure how much she should know. That both parties agreed. No formal dispute. No letter of grievance filed with the council. "Then it was handled with dignity," I said. Petra looked at me with the particular expression of a 17-year-old who understood far more than she was given credit for. "Merritt left with her," she said. "All of Lady Seraphine's attendants. The East Solar has already been cleared." I nodded and went back to folding the clean linens I'd been working through. "Willa," Petra said. "Go finish your morning work," I said, not unkindly. She went. I did not see Theron that day. The study was empty when I came for the morning rounds. Fire already lit again, the desk cleared of everything except the cracked clay cup, returned to its exact original position at the left corner edge. The window was unlatched, open a careful inch despite the cold, letting in a narrow line of winter air that moved the candle flame on the desk in a slow, continuous lean. I closed the window, tended the fire, straightened what little needed straightening, and left without having said a single word to anyone. The day passed in the ordinary work of the keep. which continued its rhythms indifferently to the personal upheavals of the people inside it. Rushes needed changing. Oil lamps needed filling. The lower kitchen required an inventory count of the dried herb stores before the next supply wagon came up from the valley settlements. I did all of it with the steady, practiced focus that had always been my best defense against thinking too much. It did not entirely work. He found me in the library. Not the grand library on the second floor, which was used for formal research and kept immaculate for the use of advisors and visiting scholars, but the smaller one, the room at the end of the eastern corridor on the third level that most of the staff didn't know existed, because it wasn't on the household maps given to new servants. I had found it in my first month, by following a draft through a partially hidden door, and had kept it as a private piece of knowledge ever since. It held perhaps 4 shelves of old bound records, 2 chairs that had seen better decades, and a window that faced west and caught the last of the afternoon light better than any other window in the keep. I went there sometimes, in the gap between afternoon and evening duties, when I had an hour that belonged to no particular task. I sat in the better of the 2 chairs, and read, or didn't read, and let the quiet be quiet. I heard his footsteps in the corridor before the door opened. I knew his walk by now, the particular, even weight of it, and I had just enough time to decide not to pretend I was surprised. He stepped inside, took in the room with a single glance, and then looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Not the contained, appropriate expression of the formal court, not the tired, weighted look of late evenings in the study, something quieter than both, something that had set down what it was carrying, at least for the moment. "You found this room," he said. "In my first month," I said. "I assumed you knew it existed." "I did." He moved to the other chair, the worse one with the uneven leg, and sat in it without appearing to notice or care that it rocked slightly. "I used to come here when I was young, before I was king, when being in the large rooms felt like too much." I looked at him. "Does it still, sometimes?" "Yes," he said simply. "Sometimes." We sat in the late afternoon light, the window between us throwing long gold shapes across the floor. Outside, the snow on the ridge was beginning to catch the color of the lowering sun. Pale orange, then rose, shifting slowly the way only winter light does, as though it has more time than it really does. He said, "I want to tell you something, and I would like you to hear it without immediately finding a professional way to deflect it." I folded my hands in my lap. "I'll try." He looked at the window for a moment, then back at me. The betrothal with House Kalin was a political arrangement, necessary in the way that many political arrangements are necessary, not because they are wanted, but because the alternative costs more than the arrangement does. Seraphine understood this. I believe she was relieved in the end to be released from it. She deserves someone who chooses her, not someone who chooses the territory she comes with. "And the Eastern passes?" I asked, because I was practical, even now. "Will be renegotiated through trade terms rather than marriage lines." A faint, dry edge in his voice. "It is less elegant. It will take longer. It is also considerably more honest." I said nothing. The light moved on the floor between us. "2 years ago," he said, "when you first came to this wing, you spent 3 days learning every room before you touched anything in them. Caden reported it as unusual. I told him it was thorough." He paused. "I noticed you from the beginning, Willa. I want you to know that. The thing I had kept in a place I couldn't easily reach, shifted, quietly, in its location." "You should have said something," I said. My voice was steady. I was proud of how steady it was. "You were a servant in my household," he said. "Saying something would have been a misuse of the position I held over you. I was not willing to do that." "And now?" He looked at me directly. "Now I am asking, as honestly as I know how, whether the distance you have kept for 2 years was entirely professional, or whether some part of it was self-protection. The last of the afternoon light was going now, the gold fading to a deep, soft amber that made the room feel closer, warmer, more like a place where honest things could be said without echoing too loudly. "Both," I said. "It was both." He nodded, as though this was the answer he had expected and the one he had hoped for simultaneously. "Then I would like to ask you something else," he said, "and you are free to answer however you choose. You are free to stand up and walk out of this room and submit that letter you never signed, and I will not prevent you, and I will not hold it against you." He leaned forward slightly, the uneven chair shifting under him. "But I would like to ask." "Ask," I said. "Will you stay? Not as a servant, not as chamber attendant or household staff or any other category that keeps you at the appropriate professional distance." His voice was even, deliberate, with the particular quality of a man who has thought carefully about what he is about to say and is saying it exactly as he means it. "Will you stay because you want to be here? Because this place has become something to you? And because—" He paused for only a moment. "Because I would very much like to learn what it is like to be in a room with you, without either of us pretending we are only what our roles require us to be." The room was very quiet. Outside, the last color left the sky, and the first stars appeared above the white ridge, sharp and cold and permanent. I thought about the letter on my table, still unsigned after all these weeks. I thought about the morning he had called me by name before dawn, and the evening he had asked what I valued more, preference or peace. I thought about 2 years of careful distance, and what it had actually cost me to maintain it, and whether the cost had been worth the safety, and whether safety was the same thing as living. I thought about the cracked clay cup back in its place on the corner of his desk. "I'll stay," I said. What followed was not swift, and it was not simple, and it was not without its difficulties, because nothing real ever is. The court had opinions, as courts always do. There were advisors who raised formal objections, citing rank and bloodline and the precedent of 100 previous unions in the Valdres line. There were nobles who spoke in the careful, coded language of disapproval that powerful people use when they cannot speak their disapproval directly. There were whispers in the lower halls, and pointed silences in the upper ones. Theron addressed the council directly, in formal session, with the same level and unhurried certainty he brought to everything. He did not ask for approval. He presented his decision as the considered choice of a king who had governed this territory for over a decade, and had earned the right to govern his own life with the same deliberateness. He listened to the objections. He answered the ones that deserved answers. He declined to argue with the ones that were rooted in something no argument would reach. It took 3 months. I spent those months in a state of careful, guarded hope. The kind of hope that keeps one hand on the door out of habit, even when it knows the door is no longer necessary. I continued my morning duties. Theron continued his. We navigated the strange new territory of being honest with each other, in a household that was still adjusting to what that honesty meant. Petra, to her credit, acted entirely unsurprised. Aldrich, when he found out, shook his head slowly and said, "I gave it about 6 months before something shifted. I was off by 4. Brennan looked confused for several days, and then seemed to simply accept it, in the way young people sometimes accept complicated things by deciding not to overthink them. Lord Caden submitted a quietly updated household record that listed my changed status without comment, as though it were an administrative adjustment of no particular note, which was perhaps the most eloquent thing he had ever done. We were married in the early spring, when the snow had gone from the ridge and the first green had returned to the valley below. There was no grand ceremony. Theron had asked me what I wanted, and I had said something small and honest. And he had said that was exactly what he wanted too. So it was the great hall with the morning light coming through the high windows, And the people who lived and worked in that place gathered together, and words spoken without performance, in front of witnesses who had watched both of us for long enough to understand what they were witnessing. Petra cried. She tried not to, and failed completely, and did not seem embarrassed about it. Aldrich stood at his post by the door with the particular expression of a guard who is moved but will not under any circumstances admit it. Lord Caden stood to the side with his ledger, which he did not open once. I kept the room at the end of the eastern corridor. Theron knew I went there, in the gaps between things, when I needed the quiet and the west-facing light. He never followed me there uninvited again. That first time had been an exception, and we both understood it as such. But occasionally, when the afternoon was long and the court had been demanding and we both needed the same thing, I would find him already there in the worst chair, the uneven one, with a book open in his lap and the west light coming through the window. He never asked permission to use it. I never asked him to. Some things don't require negotiation. They simply find their shape over time, the way water finds the path that was always there, patient and inevitable, needing only the right conditions to move. The cracked clay cup stayed on the corner of his desk for the rest of his reign. I never moved it, and he never explained it, and eventually it simply became part of the room, like the old chairs in the small library, like the worn stone of the corridor floors, like the torches that burned low before dawn in a keep that had, over time, become the kind of place where a woman from a small village at the edge of Marin's forest could stand at a window and feel, without qualification or condition, that she was exactly where she belonged. That was enough. That was, it turned out, everything.